Of course, we continue having those important conversations that we need to have in this country, given, of course, our democracy and the many issues surrounding it. Today, we hone in on where we are 25 years later. It's called Towards a 25-Year Review. That's, of course, part of the documents that have been released. And joining me in studio to have that very conversation is Professor Stephen Friedman, who's a political analyst and the Professor of Political Studies at the University of Johannesburg, and Rudy Diggs, who's the head of project management in the presidency. To the both of you, thank you very much for making time. Welcome to Newsroom Africa.
Thank you.
Now, after the headlines that we had from Carmen, I mean, all three of us were watching it essentially in silence. And I can't help but think about how difficult it's going to be in this conversation to be optimistic about anything, considering just the majority of the kind of big stories that we're reflecting on today. But let me start by first asking why it's important, or why it happens to be significant that we reflect 25 years on. I'd imagine we'd obviously need to be reflecting after every year, but is there anything significant about where we are at the moment and where we potentially might be in the next 25 years? Rudy?
So I think it's 25 years partly because it's a quarter of a century.
Just
but
nice.
No, it's not just about signing nights. It's about reflecting 25 years in a democracy. It's not about reflecting the last couple of years, but saying when we started in 1994, when we elected the new democratic government, what gains have we made? I think that's important. So we need to recognize there are some important social, economic gains that we have made, and that has happened. We can talk about social grants, we can talk about housing, we can talk about health systems and services. But I think what this does also, it provides a critique of some of the challenges that we've not been very successful, right? And I think and I brought a copy of the document with, right? It's quite a voluminous piece of work that we've done. But I think it's important for us to, at the regular intervals, reflect. We've done a 5-year review, we've done a 10-year review, we've done a 15 and a 20-year review. 25 years is also important to be able to consider where we are in our democracy. And it's a very young democracy.
Sure. Prof, let me ask you, are you feeling even remotely optimistic 25 years on?
Yeah, but I mean, it depends on what, I think people in this country tend to operate with extremes, I mean, either optimism means we're going to be absolutely wonderful and everything's going to be all right, and pessimism means that we're going to become a sort of basket case. And in the real world, neither of these things happen. In the real world, you have very real problems, which you either deal with or you don't. But as someone who I think is speaking for myself, is very skeptical about some of the development path of the last 25 years. Despite the headlines you read this evening, I don't think anybody can seriously argue that this is a fundamentally better country than it was 25 years ago. And we tend to forget that. There are all sorts of things that happen daily in this country which were banned 25 years ago, and I think that is cause for a certain amount of optimism. I think the other cause for optimism is that we've had countless experiences over the last 25 or 30 years to show that South Africans are quite good at digging themselves out of holes. Some would say that we're also very good at digging the holes in the first place. But having dug them, we tend to find ways of digging ourselves out again. So to look on the positive side, our democracy is surprisingly healthy. I don't think too many people would have said 25 years ago that it would look as the way it did. I think basic freedoms for many people have been preserved. We have regular free and fair elections, and these elections, incidentally, are getting more and more competitive all the time. We have opportunities, which I think to me is vital. We have opportunities for people living in poverty or people living with disease to use their democratic rights to change their environment. I often remind people that there are probably 5 million or more South Africans with us today who probably wouldn't be with us if there was no democracy. And I'm thinking of people who are living with HIV and AIDS. Right. Because if democracy hadn't have given them the power and the right to mobilize, to demand decent treatment, they would not be on the medication they are on today. So I think that those are the positives. I mean, the negatives to me are that is not what we did. You know, a lot of people say the politicians sold out in 1994. I don't believe that. I think the problem was what we didn't do in 1994, and what we didn't do in 1994 was do in relation to the economy and in relation to the rest of the society what we did in relation to politics. And so that we have a reality now, 25 years later, where we have a new political system, but many of those old economic patterns and those old social patterns are still there.
Right.
And the people who are running them are still there. And unless we change that, then the progress is always limited.
Sure. And we'll certainly dig deeper into that specific issue in just a moment. But let me just remind you at home that you too can weigh in on this conversation. Welcome your calls on 010-594-5140. Rudy, let me throw this to you then. Many people, in reflecting on where we are in our democracy, say that attacking poverty and deprivation should be amongst the sort of first priorities that we look at. Do you think that's still true?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the better parts of our 25 years of democracy, that if government didn't do the kinds of interventions around social grants, for instance, you know, we have one of the most extensive social grant systems in the world, that if we did not have the child support grant or extend basic pensions for all citizens of Africa, certainly the evidence in this particular book that we've done shows that people would be much more poorer. People would not be able to meet basic food needs. People would not be able to meet basic services. And I think that's quite important. So from a poverty point of view, I think the South African government has done pretty well over the 25 years to be able to ensure that you have many people within the social protection system. It's also provided basic services. So, and I think this is quite critical, that you know, you have to remember also, as Stephen says, that many of these kind of basic services that we take for granted today were not there. You know,
right.
Many black South Africans didn't have access to electricity, water or sanitation, didn't have access to housing opportunities. You know, and I think this has been the foremost in the delivery of government. Of course, there is the debate around whether this is sustainable, because if you have an extensive social intervention program that we have, how do you deal with some of the aspects that Stephen talked about? How do you develop a more equitable economy, an economy where more people are able to participate in and not only depend on social grants? And I think that's some of the debates that we reflect on in the book, and we're quite critical of it. And Stephen's point is quite correct, that I think if you continue to have an economy that grows in the direction that it is right now, which is actually not growing,